Story of Civilization, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 5, Side 2. The later scholars of antiquity debated whether these poems were expressions of lesbian love or merely exercises of poetic fancy and impersonation. It is enough for us that they are poetry of the first order, tense with feeling, vivid with imagery, and perfect in speech and form. A fragment speaks of the footfall of the flowering spring, another of love, the limb loosener, the bittersweet torment. Another compares the unattainable love to the sweet apple that reddens on the end of the bough, the very end of the bough, which the gatherers missed, nay, not missed, but could not reach so far. Sappho wrote of other topics than love, and used, even for our extant remains, 100 meters, and she herself set her poems to music for the harp. Her verse was collected into 9 books of some 12,000 lines. 600 lines survive, seldom continuous. In the year 1073 of our era, the poetry of Sappho and Alcaeus was publicly burned by ecclesiastical authorities in Constantinople and Rome. Then in 1897, Grenfell and Hunt discovered, at Oxyrhynchus in the Fayum, coffins of papier-mâché, in whose making certain scraps of old books had been used, and on these scraps were some poems of Sappho. Male posterity avenged itself upon her by handing down or inventing the tale of how she died of unrequited love for a man. A passage in Suidas tells how the courtesan Sappho, usually identified with the poetess, leaped to death from a cliff on the island of Leucas because Phaon the sailor would not return her love. Menander, Strabo, and others refer to the story, and Ovid recounts it in loving detail, but it has many earmarks of legend, and must be left hovering nebulously between fiction and fact. In her later years, tradition said, Sappho had relearned the love of men. Among the Egyptian morsels is her touching reply to a proposal of marriage. If my breasts were still capable of giving suck, and my womb were able to bear children, then to another marriage bed not with trembling feet would I come. But now on my skin age has brought many lines, and love hastens not to me with his gift of pain. And she advises her suitor to seek a younger wife. In truth, we do not know when she died or how. We know only that she left behind her a vivid memory of passion, poetry, and grace, and that she shone even above Alcaeus as the most melodious singer of her time. Gently, in a final fragment, she reproves those who would not admit that her song was finished. You dishonor the good gifts of the Muses, my children, when you say, We will crown you, dear Sappho, best player of the clear sweet lyre. Know you not that my skin is all wrinkled with age, and my hair is turned from black to white? Surely as starry night follows rose-armed dawn, and brings darkness to the ends of the earth, so death tracketh everything living, and catcheth it in the end. 6. The Northern Empire. North of Lesbos is little Tenedos, whose women were accounted by some ancient travelers to be the most beautiful in Greece. Then one follows the adventurous Hellenes into the northern Sporades, to Imbros and Lemnos and Samothrace. The Milesians, seeking to control the Hellespont, founded, about 560, the still-living town of Abydos on its south shore. Here Leander and Byron swam the straits, and Xerxes' army crossed to Europe on a bridge of boats. Farther eastward, the Phocaeans settled Lampsacus, birthplace of Epicurus. Within the Propontis lay 2 groups of islands, the Proconnesus, rich in the marble that gave the Propontis its current name, the Sea of Marmara, and the Arctonesus, on whose southernmost tip the Milesians established in 757 the great port of Cyzicus. Along the coast rose one Greek city after another, Panormus, Dascylium, Apamea, Chios, Astacus, Chalcedon. Up through the Bosporus the Greeks advanced, hungry for metals, grain, and trade, founding Chrysopolis, now Scutari, and Nicopolis, city of victory. Then they made their way along the southern shore of the Black Sea, depositing towns at Heraclea, Pontica, Tium, and Sinope, a city splendidly adorned, says Strabo, with gymnasium, agora, and shady colonnades. Diogenes the Cynic was not above being born here. Then Amisus, Enoi, Tripolis, and Trapezus, or Trebizond or Trabzon, where Xenophon's 10,000 shouted with joy at the sight of the longed-for sea. The opening up of this region to Greek colonization, perhaps by Jason, later by the Ionians, gave the mother cities the same outlet for surplus population and trade the same resources in food, silver, and gold that the discovery of America gave to Europe at the beginning of modern times. Following the eastern shores of the Euxine northward into Medea's Caucasus, the Greeks founded Phasis and Dioscurus, and Theodosia and Panticapaeum on the Crimea. Near the mouths of the Bug and the Dnieper, they established the city of Olbia, or Nikolaev, at the mouth of the Dniester, the town of Tyrus, and on the Danube, Trismus. Then, moving southward along the west shore of the Black Sea, they built the cities of Istris, Constanta or Kustanje, Tomi, where Ovid died, Odessus, or Varna, and Apollonia, or Burgas. The historically sensitive traveler stands appalled at the antiquity of these living towns, but today's residents, engrossed in the tasks of their own generation, are undisturbed by the depth of the centuries that lie silent beneath them. Then again at the Bosporus, the Megarians, about 660, built Byzantium, yesterday Constantinople, now Istanbul. Even before Pericles, this strategic port was becoming what Napoleon would call it at the Peace of Tilsit, the key to Europe. In the 3rd century B.C., Polybius described its maritime position as more favorable to security and prosperity than that of any other city in the world known to us. Byzantium grew rich by exacting tolls from passing vessels and exporting to the Greek world the grain of southern Russia, or Scythia, and the Balkans, and the fish that were netted with shameful ease as they crowded through the narrow straits. It was its curving form and the wealth derived from this fishing industry that gave the city its later name, the Golden Horn. Under Pericles, Athens dominated Byzantine polities, levied tolls there to fill her treasury in time of emergency, and regulated the export of grain from the Black Sea as a contraband of war. Along the northern or Thracian shore of the Propontis, the Greeks built towns at Selymbria, Corinthus, or Erigli, Byzanthi, Gallipolis, or Gallipoli, and Cestus. Later settlements were established on the southwestern coast of Thrace at Aphrodisias, Enos, and Abdera, where Leucippus and Democritus would propound the philosophy of atomistic materialism. Off the coast of Thrace lay the island of Thasos, bare and ugly as a donkey's back in the sea, Archilochus described it, but so rich in gold mines that their proceeds paid all the expenses of the government. On or near the eastern coast of Macedonia, Greek gold-seekers, chiefly Athenians, founded Neapolis and Amphipolis, whose capture by Philip would lead to the war in which Athens was to lose her liberty. Other Greeks, mostly from Chalcis and Eretria, conquered and named the three-fingered peninsula of Chalcidice, and by 700 had established 30 towns there, several of them destined to play a role in Greek history. Stagirus, birthplace of Aristotle, Sione, Mendi, Potidaea, Acanthus, Cleone, Torone, and Olynthus, captured by Philip in 348 and known to us now through the oratory of Demosthenes. Recent excavations at Olynthus have unearthed a town of considerable extent, with many houses of 2 stories and some of 25 rooms. In the time of Philip, Olynthus appears to have had 60,000 inhabitants. We may judge from this figure for a minor city the abounding fertility and energetic expansion of the pre-Periclean Greeks. Finally, between Chalcidice and Euboea, Ionian migrants peopled the Euboean Isles: Gerontia, Polyegos, Ecos, Paparethos, Scandali, Skyros. The orbit of empire in east and north had come full turn. The circuit was complete. Greek enterprise had transformed the islands of the Aegean and the coasts of Asia Minor, the Hellespont, the Black Sea, Macedonia, and Thrace, into a busy network of Hellenized cities, throbbing with agriculture, industry, trade, politics, literature, religion, philosophy, science, art, eloquence, chicanery, and venery. It only remained to conquer another Greece in the west and build a bridge between ancient Hellas and the modern world. Chapter 7. The Greeks in the West. 1. The Sybarites. Skirting Sunium again, our ship of fancy, sailing westward, finds Cythera, island haunt of Aphrodite, and therefore the goal of Watteau's embarkation. There, about A.D. 160, Pausanias saw the most holy and ancient of all the temples that the Greeks have built to Aphrodite. And there, in 1887, Schliemann dug its ruins out of the earth. Cythera was the southernmost of the Ionian islands that bordered the west coast of Greece, and so named because Ionian immigrants settled them. Zacynthus, Cephallenia, Ithaca, Lucus, Paxos, and Corcyra made the rest, Schliemann thought that Ithaca was the island of Odysseus, and vainly sought under its soil some confirmation of Homer's tale. But Dürpfeld believed that Odysseus's home was on rocky Leucas. From the cliffs of Leucas, as an annual sacrifice to Apollo, the ancient Leucadians, says Strabo, were in the habit of hurling a human victim. But being men as well as theologians, they mercifully attached to him powerful birds whose wings might break his fall. Probably the story of Sappho's leap is bound up with memories of this rite. Corinthian colonists occupied Corcyra, or Corfu, about 734 B.C., and soon became so strong that they defeated Corinth's navy and established their independence. From Corcyra, some Greek adventurers sailed up the Adriatic as far as Venice. Some made small settlements on the Dalmatian coast and in the valley of the Po. Others crossed at last through 50 miles of stormy water to the heel of Italy. They found a magnificent shoreline, curved into natural harbors and backed by a fertile hinterland that had been almost neglected by the aborigines. The Greek invaders took possession of this coastal region by the ruthless law of colonial expansion, that natural resources unexploited by the native population will draw in by a kind of chemical attraction some other people to exploit them and pour them into the commerce and usage of the world. From Brentisium, the newcomers, chiefly Dorian, traversed the heel of the peninsula to establish a major city at Taris, the Roman Tarentum, or Taranto. There they grew olives, raised horses, manufactured pottery, built ships, netted fish, and gathered mussels to make a purple dye more highly valued than the Phoenician. As in most of the Greek colonies, the government began as an oligarchy of landowners, passed under dictators financed by the middle class, and enjoyed vigorous and turbulent intervals of democracy. Here the romantic Pyrrhus would land, in 281 B.C., and undertake to play Alexander to the west. Across the Tarentine Gulf, a new wave of immigrants, mostly Achaeans, founded the cities of Sybaris and Crotona. The murderous jealousy of these kindred states illustrates the creative energy and destructive passions of the Greeks. Trade between eastern Greece and western Italy had a choice of two routes, one by water, the other in part by land. Ships following the water route touched at Crotona and exchanged many goods there. Thence they passed on to Rhegium, paid tolls, and moved cautiously through pirate-ridden seas and the swirling currents of the Messina Straits to Ilia and Cumae, the northernmost Greek settlement in Italy. To avoid these tolls and perils, and 100 extra miles of rowing and sailing, merchants who chose the other route unloaded their cargoes at Sybaris, carried them overland some 30 miles to the western coast at Laius, and reshipped them to Poseidonia, whence they were marketed into the interior of Italy. Strategically situated on this line of trade, Sybaris prospered until it had, if we may believe Diodorus Siculus, 300,000 population, and such wealth as few Greek cities could match. Sybarite became a synonym for Epicurean. All physical labor was performed by slaves or serfs, while the citizens, dressed in costly robes, took their ease in luxurious homes and consumed exotic delicacies. Men whose work was noisy, such as carpenters and smiths, were forbidden to practice their crafts within the confines of the city. Some of the roads in the richer districts were covered with awnings as a protection against heat and rain. Alcisthenes of Sybaris, says Aristotle, had a robe of such precious stuffs that Dionysius I of Syracuse later sold it for 120 talents, or $720,000. Smindirides of Sybaris, visiting Sicyon to sue for the hand of Cleisthenes' daughter, brought with him 1,000 servants. All went well with Sybaris until it slipped into war with its neighbor Crotona in 510. We are unreliably informed that the Sybarites marched out to battle with an army of 300,000 men. The Crotoniates, we are further assured, drew this force into confusion by playing the tunes to which the Sybarites had taught their horses to dance. The horses danced, the Sybarites were slaughtered, and their city was so conscientiously sacked and burned that it disappeared from history in a day. When, 65 years later, Herodotus and other Athenians established near the site the new colony of Thurii, they found hardly a trace of what had been the proudest community in Greece. 2. Pythagoras of Crotona. Crotona lasted longer. Founded about 710 B.C., it is, as Crotone, still noisy with industry and trade. It had the only natural harbor between Taurus and Sicily and could not forgive those ships that discharged their cargoes at Sybaris. Enough trade remained to give the citizens a comfortable prosperity, while a wholesome defeat in war, a long economic depression, a brisk climate, and a certain Dorico-Puritan mood in the population conspired to keep them vigorous despite their wealth. Here grew famous athletes like Milo and the greatest school of medicine in Magna Graecia. Perhaps it was its reputation as a health resort that drew Pythagoras to Crotona. The name means mouthpiece of the Pythian oracle at Delphi. Many of his followers considered him to be Apollo himself, and some laid claim to have caught a flash of his golden thigh. Tradition assigned his birth to Samos about 580, spoke of his studious youth, and gave him 30 years of travel. Of all men, says Heraclitus, who praised parsimoniously, Pythagoras was the most assiduous inquirer. He visited, we are told, Arabia, Syria, Phoenicia, Chaldea, India, and Gaul, and came back with an admirable motto for tourists. When you are traveling abroad, look not back at your own borders. Prejudices should be checked at every port of entry. More surely he visited Egypt, where he studied with the priests and learned much astronomy and geometry, and perhaps a little nonsense. Returning to Samos and finding that the dictatorship of Polycrates interfered with his own, he migrated to Crotona, being now over 50 years of age. There he set up as a teacher, and his imposing presence, his varied learning, and his willingness to receive women as well as men into his school soon brought him several hundred students. 2 centuries before Plato, he laid down the principle of equal opportunity for both sexes, and did not merely preach it, but practiced it. Nevertheless, he recognized natural differences of function. He gave his women pupils considerable training in philosophy and literature, but he had them instructed as well in maternal and domestic arts, so that the Pythagorean women were honored by antiquity as the highest feminine type that Greece ever produced. For the students in general, Pythagoras established rules that almost turned the school into a monastery. The members bound themselves by a vow of loyalty, both to the master and to one another. Ancient tradition is unanimous that they practiced a communistic sharing of goods while they lived in the Pythagorean community. They were not to eat flesh or eggs or beans. Wine was not forbidden, but water was recommended, a dangerous prescription in Lower Italy today. Possibly the prohibition of flesh food was a religious taboo bound up with the belief in the transmigration of souls. Men must be aware of eating their ancestors. Probably there were dispensations now and then from the letter of these rules. English historians in particular find it incredible that the wrestler Milo, who was a Pythagorean, had become the strongest man in Greece without the help of beef, though the calf that became a bull in his arms managed well enough on grass. The members were forbidden to kill any animal that does not injure man, or to destroy a cultivated tree. They were to dress simply and behave modestly, never yielding to laughter and yet not looking stern. They were not to swear by the gods, for every man ought so to live as to be worthy of belief without an oath. They were not to offer victims in sacrifice, but they might worship at altars that were unstained with blood. At the close of each day they were to ask themselves what wrongs they had committed, what duties they had neglected, what good they had done. Pythagoras himself, unless he was an excellent actor, followed these rules more rigorously than any student. Certainly his mode of life won for him such respect and authority among his pupils that no one grumbled at his pedagogical dictatorship, and autos epha, ipsi dixit, he himself has said it, became their formula for a final decision in almost any field of conduct or theory. We are told with touching reverence that the master never drank wine by day and lived for the most part on bread and honey, with vegetables as dessert, that his robe was always white and spotless, that he was never known to eat too much or to make love, that he never indulged in laughter or jests or stories, that he never chastised anyone, not even a slave. Timon of Athens thought him a juggler of solemn speech engaged in fishing for men. But among his most devoted followers were his wife Theano and his daughter Damo, who had facilities for comparing his philosophy with his life. To Damo, says Diogenes Laertius, he entrusted his commentaries and charged her to divulge them to no person out of the house, and she, though she might have sold his discourses for much money, would not abandon them, for she thought obedience to her father's injunctions more valuable than gold, and that too though she was a woman. Initiation into the Pythagorean society required, in addition to purification of the body by abstinence and self-control, a purification of the mind by scientific study. The new pupil was expected to preserve for 5 years the Pythagorean silence, that is, presumably to accept instruction without questions or argument, before being accounted a full member, or being permitted to, quote, see, meaning perhaps study under, Pythagoras. The scholars were accordingly divided into exoterici, or outer students, and esoterici, or inner members, who were entitled to the secret wisdom of the master himself. 4 subjects composed the curriculum: geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. Mathematics came first, not as the practical science that the Egyptians had made it, but as an abstract theory of quantities and an ideal logical training in which thinking would be compelled to order and clarity by the test of rigorous deduction and visible proof. Geometry now definitely received the form of axiom, theorem, and demonstration. Each step in the sequence of propositions raised the student to a new platform, as the Pythagoreans put it, from which he might view more widely the secret structure of the world. Pythagoras himself, according to Greek tradition, discovered many theorems. Above all, that the sum of the angles within any triangle equals 2 right angles, and that the square of the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle equals the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. Apollodorus tells us that when the master discovered this theorem, he sacrificed a hecatomb, 100 animals, in thanksgiving. But this would have been scandalously un-Pythagorean. From geometry, inverting the modern order, Pythagoras passed to arithmetic, not as a practical art of reckoning, but as the abstract theory of numbers. The school seems to have made the first classification of numbers into odd or even, prime or factorable. It formulated the theory of proportion, and through this and the application of areas, created a geometrical algebra. Perhaps it was the study of proportion that led Pythagoras to reduce music to number. One day, as he passed a blacksmith's shop, his ear was attracted by the apparently regular musical intervals of the sounds that came from the anvil. Finding that the hammers were of different weights, he concluded that tones depend upon numerical ratios. In one of the few experiments which we hear of in classical science, he took 2 strings of equal thickness and equal tension, and discovered that if one was twice as long as the other, they sounded an octave when he plucked them. If one was half again the length of the other, they gave a fifth, do and sol. If one was a third longer than the other, they gave a fourth, do and fa. In this way, every musical interval could be mathematically calculated and expressed. Since all bodies moving in space produce sounds, whose pitch depends upon the size and speed of the body, then each planet in its orbit about the Earth, argued Pythagoras, makes a sound proportioned to its rapidity of translation, which in turn rises with its distance from the Earth. And these diverse notes constitute a harmony, or music of the spheres, which we never hear, because we hear it all the time. The universe, said Pythagoras, is a living sphere, whose center is the Earth. The Earth, too, is a sphere, revolving like the planets, from west to east. The Earth, indeed the whole universe, is divided into 5 zones: Arctic, Antarctic, summer, winter, and equatorial. More or less of the moon is visible to us according to the degree in which that half of it which is facing the sun is also turned toward the Earth. Eclipses of the moon are caused by the interposition of the Earth or some other body between the moon and the sun. Pythagoras, says Diogenes Laertius, was the first person to call the Earth round and to give the name of cosmos to the world. Having with these contributions to mathematics and astronomy done more than any other man to establish science in Europe, Pythagoras proceeded to philosophy. The very word is apparently one of his creations. He rejected the term sophia, or wisdom, as pretentious, and described his own pursuit of understanding as philosophia, the love of wisdom. In the 6th century, philosopher and Pythagorean were synonyms. Whereas Thales and the other Milesians had sought the first principle of all things in matter, Pythagoras sought it in form. Having discovered numerically regular relations and sequences in music, and having postulated them in the planets, he made the philosopher's leap at unity by announcing that such numerically regular relations and sequences existed everywhere, and that the essential factor in everything was number. Just as Spinoza would argue that there were 2 worlds, one the people's world of things perceived by sense, the other the philosopher's world of laws and constancies perceived by reason, and that only the second world was permanently real, so Pythagoras felt that the only basic and lasting aspects of anything were the numerical relationships of its parts. Perhaps health was a proper mathematical relationship or proportion in the parts or elements of the body. Perhaps even the soul was number. At this point, the mysticism in Pythagoras, nurtured in Egypt and the Near East, disported itself freely. The soul, he believed, is divided into 3 parts: feeling, intuition, and reason. Feeling is centered in the heart, intuition and reason in the brain. Feeling and intuition belong to animals as well as men. Reason belongs to man alone and is immortal. After death, the soul undergoes a period of purgation in Hades. Then it returns to earth and enters as a new body in a chain of transmigration that can be ended only by a completely virtuous life. Pythagoras amused, or perhaps edified, his followers by telling them that he had been in one incarnation a courtesan, in another the hero Euphorbus. He could remember quite distinctly his adventures at the siege of Troy, and recognized in a temple at Argos the armor that he had worn in that ancient life. Hearing the yelp of a beaten dog, he went at once to the rescue of the animal, saying that he distinguished in its cries the voice of a dead friend. We catch again a glimpse of the trade in ideas that bound 6th century Greece, Africa, and Asia, when we reflect that this idea of metempsychosis was at one and the same time capturing the imagination of India, of the Orphic cult in Greece, and of a philosophical school in Italy. We feel the hot breath of Hindu pessimism mingling in the ethics of Pythagoras with the clear, bright air of Plato. The purpose of life in the Pythagorean system is to gain release from reincarnation. The method is through virtue, and virtue is a harmony of the soul within itself and with God. Sometimes this harmony can be artificially induced, and the Pythagoreans, like Greek priests and doctors, used music to heal nervous disorders. More often, harmony comes to the soul through wisdom, a quiet understanding of underlying truths, for such wisdom teaches a man modesty, measure, and the golden mean. The opposite way, the way of discord, excess, and sin, leads by inevitable fate to tragedy and punishment. Justice is a square number, and sooner or later every wrong will be squared with an equivalent penalty. Here in germ are the moral philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. Pythagorean politics is Plato's philosophy realized before its conception. According to the common tradition of antiquity, the school of Pythagoras was a communistic aristocracy, men and women pooling their goods, educated together, trained to virtue and high thinking by mathematics, music, and philosophy, and offering themselves as the guardian rulers of the state. Indeed, it was Pythagoras' effort to make his society the actual government of his city that brought ruin upon himself and his followers. The initiates entered so actively into politics and took so decidedly the aristocratic side that the democratic or popular party of Crotona, in an ecstasy of rage, burned down the house in which the Pythagoreans were gathered, killed several of them, and drove the rest out of the city. Pythagoras himself, in one account, was captured and slain when, in his flight, he refused to tread upon a field of beans. Another story lets him escape to Metapontum, where he abstained from food for 40 days and, perhaps feeling that 80 years were enough, starved himself to death. His influence was lasting. Even today he is a potent name. His society survived for 3 centuries in scattered groups throughout Greece, producing scientists like Philolaus of Thebes, and statesmen like Archytas, dictator of Taras and friend of Plato. Wordsworth, in his most famous ode, was an unconscious Pythagorean. Plato himself was enthralled by the vague figure of Pythagoras. At every turn he takes from him. In his scorn of democracy, his yearning for a communistic aristocracy of philosopher rulers, his conception of virtue as harmony, his theories of the nature and destiny of the soul, his love of geometry, and his addiction to the mysticism of number. All in all, Pythagoras was the founder, so far as we know them, of both science and philosophy in Europe, an achievement sufficient for any man. 3. Xenophanes of Aelia. West of Crotona lies the site of ancient Locri. The colony was founded, says Aristotle, by runaway slaves, adulterers, and thieves from Locris in mainland Greece. But perhaps Aristotle had an old-world disdain for the new. Suffering disorder from the defects of their qualities, the colonists applied to the oracle at Delphi for advice, and were told to get themselves laws. Possibly Zaleucus had instructed the oracle, for about 664 he gave to Locri ordinances which, as he said, Athena had dictated to him in a dream. This was the first written code of laws in the history of Greece, though not the first to be handed down by the gods. The Locrians liked it so well that they required any man who wished to propose a new law to speak with a rope around his neck, so that if his motion failed he might be hanged with a minimum of public inconvenience. Rounding the toe of Italy northward, the traveler reaches flourishing Reggio, founded by the Messenians about 730 under the name of Rhegion, and known to the Romans as Rhegium. Slipping through the Straits of Messina, probably the Scylla and Charybdis of the Odyssey, one comes to where Laius stood, and then to ancient Yale, the Roman Velia, known to history as Elia because Plato wrote it so, and because only its philosophers are remembered. There Xenophanes of Colophon came about 510 and founded the Eleatic school. He was a personality as unique as his favorite foe, Pythagoras. A man of dauntless energy and reckless initiative, he wandered for 67 years, he tells us, up and down the land of Hellas, making observations and enemies everywhere. He wrote and recited philosophical poems, denounced Homer for his impious ribaldry, laughed at superstition, found a port in Elia, and obstinately completed a century before he died. Homer and Hesiod, sang Xenophanes, have ascribed to the gods all deeds that are a shame and a disgrace among men, thieving, adultery, and fraud. But he himself was not a pillar of orthodoxy. There never was, nor ever will be, any man who knows with certainty the things about the gods. Mortals fancy that gods are born and wear clothes and have voice and form like themselves. Yet if oxen and lions had hands and could paint and fashion images as men do, they would make the pictures and images of their gods in their own likeness. Horses would make them like horses, oxen like oxen. Ethiopians make their gods black and snub-nosed. Thracians give theirs blue eyes and red hair. There is one God, supreme among gods and men, resembling mortals neither in form nor in mind. The whole of him sees, the whole of him thinks, the whole of him hears. Without toil he rules all things by the power of his mind. This God, says Diogenes Laertius, was identified by Xenophanes with the universe. All things, even men, taught the philosopher, are derived from earth and water by natural laws. Water once covered nearly all the earth, for marine fossils are found far inland and on mountain tops. And at some future time water will probably cover the whole earth again. Nevertheless, all change in history and all separateness in things are superficial phenomena. Beneath the flux and variety of forms is an unchanging unity, which is the innermost reality of God. From this starting point, Xenophanes' disciple, Parmenides of Elea, proceeded to that idealistic philosophy which was in turn to mold the thought of Plato and Platonists throughout antiquity, and of Europe even to our day. 4. From Italy to Spain. 20 miles north of Elea lay the city of Poseidonia, the Roman Paestum, founded by colonists from Sybaris as the main Italian terminus of Milesian trade. Today one reaches it by a pleasant ride from Naples through Salerno. Suddenly, by the roadside, amid a deserted field, 3 temples appear, majestic even in their desolation. For the river, by blocking its own mouth here with centuries of silt, has long since turned this once healthy valley into a swamp, and even the reckless race that tills the slopes of Vesuvius has fled in despair from these malarial plains. Fragments of the ancient walls remain, but better preserved as if by solitude are the shrines that the Greeks raised in modest limestone but almost perfect form to the gods of the corn and the sea. The oldest of the buildings, lately called the Basilica, was more likely a temple to Poseidon. Men who owed their living to the fruit and commerce of the Mediterranean dedicated it to him towards the middle of this amazing 6th century B.C., which created great art, literature, and philosophy from Italy to Shantung. The inner as well as the outer colonnades remain, and attest the columnar passion of the Greeks. The following generation built a smaller temple, also Dorically simple and strong. We call it the Temple of Ceres, but we do not know what god sniffed the savor of its offerings. A yet later generation, just before or after the Persian War, erected the greatest and best proportioned of the 3 temples, probably also to Poseidon, fittingly enough, since from its porticos one gazes into the inviting face of the treacherous sea. Again, almost everything is columns, a powerful and complete Doric peristyle without, and within, a 2-storied colonnade that once upheld a roof. Here is one of the most impressive sights in Italy. It seems incredible that this temple, better preserved than anything built by the Romans, was the work of Greeks almost 5 centuries before Christ. We can imagine something of the beauty and vitality of a community that had both the resources and the taste to raise such centers for its religious life. And then we can conjure up less inadequately the splendor of richer and vaster cities like Miletus, Samos, Ephesus, Crotona, Sybaris, and Syracuse. Slightly north of where Naples stands today, adventurers from Chalcis, Eretria, Euboean Cyme, and Graia founded about 750 the great port of Cumae, oldest of Greek towns in the west. Taking the products of eastern Greece and selling them in central Italy, Cumae rapidly acquired wealth, colonized and controlled Rhegium, obtained command of the Straits of Messina, and excluded from them, or subjected to heavy tolls, the vessels of cities not leagued with it in trade. Spreading southward, the Cumaeans founded Dicearchia, which became the Roman port of Puteoli, or Puteoli, and Neapolis, or New City, our Naples. From these colonies, Greek ideas as well as goods passed into the crude young city of Rome, and northward into Etruria. At Cumae, the Romans picked up several Greek gods, Apollo and Heracles especially, and bought for more than they were worth the scrolls in which the Cumaean Sibyl, the aged priestess of Apollo, had foretold the future of Rome. Near the beginning of the 6th century, the Phocaeans of Ionia landed on the southern shore of France, founded Massalia, or Marseille, and carried Greek products up the Rhone and its branches as far as Arles and Nîmes. They made friends and wives of the natives, introduced the olive and the vine as gifts to France, and so familiarized southern Gaul with Greek civilization that Rome found it easy to spread its kindred culture there in Caesar's time. Ranging along the coast to the east, the Phocaeans established Antipolis, or Antibes, Nicaea, or Nice, and Monicus, or Monaco. Westward they ventured into Spain and built the towns of Rodi, or Rosas, Emporium, or Amporius, Hemeroscopium, and Minaca, near Malaga. The Greeks in Spain flourished for a while by exploiting the silver mines of Tartessus, but in 535 the Carthaginians and Etruscans combined their forces to destroy the Phocaean fleet, and from that time Greek power in the western Mediterranean waned. 5. Sicily. We have left, not quite to the last, the richest of all the regions colonized by the Greeks. To Sicily, nature had given what she had withheld from continental Greece, an apparently inexhaustible soil fertilized by rain and lava, and producing so much wheat and corn that Sicily was thought to be, if not the birthplace, at least a favorite haunt of Demeter herself. Here were orchards, vineyards, olive groves heavy with fruit, honey as succulent as Hymettus's, and flowers blooming in their turn from the beginning to the end of the year. Grassy plains pastured sheep and cattle, endless timber grew in the hills, and the fish in the surrounding waters reproduced faster than Sicily could eat them. A Neolithic culture had flourished here in the 3rd millennium before Christ, a bronze culture in the 2nd. Even in Minoan days, trade had bound the island with Crete and Greece. Towards the end of the 2nd millennium, 3 waves of immigration broke upon Sicilian shores. The Sicans came from Spain, the Elami from Asia Minor, the Sicels from Italy. About 800, the Phoenicians established themselves at Motia and Panormus, or Palermo, in the west. From 735 on, the Greeks poured in, and in quick succession founded Naxos, Syracuse, Leontini, Messana, or Messina, Catana, Gela, Himera, Selinus, and Acragas. In all these cases, the natives were driven from the coast by force of arms. Most of them retired to till the mountainous interior. Some became slaves to the invaders. So many others intermarried with the conquerors that Greek blood, character, and morals in Sicily took on a perceptible native tint of passion and sensuality. The Hellenes never quite conquered the island. The Phoenicians and Carthaginians remained predominant on the west coast, and for 500 years periodic war marked the struggle of Greek and Semite, Europe and Africa, for the possession of Sicily. After 13 centuries of domination by Rome, that contest would be resumed in the Middle Ages between Norman and Saracen. Catana was distinguished for its laws, the Lipari Islands for their communism, Himera for its poet, Segesta, Selinus, and Acragas for their temples, Syracuse for its power and wealth. The laws that Carandus gave to Catana, a full generation before Solon, became a model for many cities in Sicily and Italy, and served to create public order and sexual morality in communities unprotected by ancient mores and sacred precedents. A man might divorce his wife or a wife her husband, said Carandus, but then he or she must not marry anyone younger than the divorced mate. Carandus, according to a typically Greek tale, forbade the citizens to enter the assembly while armed. One day, however, he himself came to the public meeting forgetfully wearing his sword. When a voter reproached him for breaking his own law, he answered, "I will rather confirm it," and slew himself. If we wish to visualize the difficulties of life in colonies carved out by violent conquest, we need only contemplate the curious communism of the Lipari, that is, the Glorious Islands, which lie to the north of eastern Sicily. Here, about 580, some adventurers from Cnidus organized a pirate's paradise. Preying upon the commerce about the straits, they brought the booty to their island lairs and shared it with exemplary equality. The land was owned by the community, a part of the population was assigned to till it, and the products were distributed in like shares to all the citizens. In time, however, individualism reasserted itself. The land was divided into plots individually owned, and life resumed the uneven tenor of its competitive way. On the northern coast of Sicily lay Himera, destined to be the Plataea of the west. There Stesichorus, maker of choruses at a time when the Greeks were tiring of epics, recast into the form of choral lyrics the legends of the race, and gave even to Helen and Achilles the passing novelty of modern dress. As if to bridge the gap between the dying epic and the future novel, Stesichorus composed love stories in verse. In one of these, a pure and timid lass dies of unrequited love, in the style of Provençal madrigals or Victorian fiction. At the same time, he opened a pathway for Theocritus by writing a pastoral poem on the death of the shepherd Daphnis, whose love for Chloe was to be the main business of the Greek novel in the Roman age. Stesichorus had his own romance, and with no less a lady than Helen herself. Having lost his sight, he attributed this calamity to his having handed down a tale of Helen's infidelity. To atone to her, for she was now a goddess, he composed a palinode, or second song, assuring the world that Helen had been kidnapped by force, had never yielded to Paris, had never gone to Troy, but had waited intact in Egypt until Menelaus came to rescue her. In his old age, the poet warned Himera against giving dictatorial power to Phalaris of Acragas. He cast his warning into the form of a fable. A horse, annoyed by the invasion of a stag into its pasturage, asked a man to help it punish the poacher. The man promised to do this if the horse would allow him to bestride it, javelin in hand. The horse agreed, the stag was frightened away, and the horse found that he was now a slave to the man. Being unheeded, he moved to Catana, where his monumental tomb was one of the sights of Roman Sicily. West of Himera lay Segesta, of which nothing remains but a peristyle of unfinished Doric columns weirdly rising amid surrounding weeds. To find Sicilian architecture at its best, we must cross the island southward to the once great cities of Selinus and Acragas. During its tragic tenure of life, from its establishment in 651 to its destruction by Carthaginians in 409, Selinus raised to the silent gods 7 Doric temples, immense in size but of imperfect workmanship, covered with painted plaster and decorated with crude reliefs. The demon of earthquake destroyed these temples at a date unknown, and little survives of them but broken columns and capitals sprawling on the ground. Acragas, the Roman Agrigentum, was in the 6th century the largest and richest city in Sicily. We picture it rising from its busy wharves through a noisy marketplace to the homes on the slope of the hill, and the stately Acropolis, whose shrines almost lifted their worshippers to the sky. Here, as in most of the Greek colonies, the landowning aristocracy yielded power to a dictatorship representing chiefly the middle class. In 570, Phalaris seized the government and secured immortality by roasting his enemies in a brazen bull. He was particularly pleased by a contrivance that made the agonized cries of his victims sound through a mechanism of pipes like the bellowing of the animal. Nevertheless, it was to him and a later dictator, Theron, that the city owed the political order and stability that permitted its economic development. The merchants of Acragas, like those of Selinus, Crotona, and Sybaris, became the American millionaires of their time, upon whom the lesser plutocrats of older Greece looked with secret envy and compensatory scorn. The new world, said the old, was interested in size and show, but had no taste or artistry. The temple of Zeus at Acragas unquestionably sought size, for Polybius describes it as second to none in Greece in dimensions and design. We cannot directly judge its beauty, for wars and earthquakes destroyed it. A generation later, in the age of Pericles, Acragas raised more modest structures. This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1.